This year is coming to a close. Today is the second to last day of 2020. It is December 30th, 2020. Tomorrow is December 31st, 2020, which is New Year's Eve, and then the day after that is the first day of the new year. Tomorrow is December 31st. The day after that is January 1st, 2021. So the new year is about to be here, and since this year is about to end, for the past few days, I've been making a video series where I basically described all the events that took place, all the major events that took place in the past 12 months, starting from January 1st of this year, all the way up until today. I guess tomorrow is technically not included in this video series because I didn't want to make this video series on the very last day of the year. I have another video planned for tomorrow. I think that'll be interesting, hopefully. I don't know, we'll see, but 4 days ago, I started this video series, and I decided to split 2020 up into 5 separate parts because there was too much happened this year to only make one video over it. So I thought it would be a better idea to split up the year into 5 separate sections and then do 5 videos over 2020. That way, I could just do a different video over each section of the year, and in total, there would be 5 videos. So I've already made 4 videos talking about events that took place in 2020, and this will be a fifth and final video. The first video that I made 4 days ago, that talked about events taking place from January 1st, 2020 to March 10th, 2020. And the second video that I made 3 days ago talked about March 11th through May 24th. The reason why I made March 10th and March 11th the cutoff was because on March 10th, Joe Biden swept Super Tuesday 2, winning 5 out of the 6 Democratic primaries on that date, and March 11th, COVID-19 was officially declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization. And then the second section ends at May 24th, the third one begins at May 25th. And the main reason for that is because George Floyd was killed on May 25th, and the killing of George Floyd led to protests all across the country, and I feel like that was one of the most defining events of the third section of this year, which took place from May 25th, 2020 to August 16th, 2020. Now, the reason why I ended the third section off at August 16th and starting the fourth section off at August 17th is because August 17th was the first day of the Democratic National Convention. The Democratic National Convention this year is what officially made Joe Biden the nominee for the Democratic Party in this year's presidential election, and the week after that, from August 24th through August 27th, that was the Republican National Convention. That's what officially made Donald Trump the Republican nominee for the 2020 presidential election. And I decided that that would be where the fourth section of this year began. That is essentially what kicked off the campaign cycle for this year's presidential election. These two conventions are what made Biden and Trump the official nominees for their respective political parties, and after that, they were able to actually start campaigning for president. They did a bit of that in the summer and spring, but a lot more of that happened in the fall. The fourth section of this year goes from August 17th through November 2nd. Now, the main reason why I ended the fourth section off at November 2nd and started the last one at November 3rd is because the 2020 presidential election took place on November 3rd. I guess the House and Senate elections also took place on that date, but the presidential election is the one that most people pay attention to the most. So the final section of this year began on November 3rd, 2020, and technically it should go to tomorrow, December 31st, 2020, but I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I can't predict the future, so this video can only describe events that happened up until December 30th, 2020. On that date, instead, there were 2 simultaneous town halls on 2 separate channels, and then there was also one vice presidential debate, but one big issue leading up to the election was whether or not there would be voter fraud in this election. A lot of people were saying that there would be a lot of voter fraud taking place in this election, especially with mail in ballots, and there's a reason why this is pretty important. We'll get to that later on in this video. So, this was a pretty heated election, especially leading up to it, but also after the election, it was really heated because this was one of the most important elections, probably the most important election of my lifetime, because the winner of this presidential election would have to oversee the rest of the COVID-19 pandemic. They'd have to oversee, I would say, like the second half of this pandemic, because it started in the spring of this year, but it's going to last well into 2021. So the person who had won that election, they would have to figure out how to get us out of that situation and how to make things better. Besides just the pandemic itself, there were also the economic impacts of the pandemic, which have been devastating for many families across the country. And lots of people have been evicted or can't pay their bills, and the federal government has not done a good job of stepping in to help out its citizens. they took so many months to pass the second stimulus package after they passed the original one back in March, the CARES Act. So, federal government, they didn't do a great job of responding to the economic concerns of its citizens, and because of that, a lot of people have been struggling throughout this past year. And then there were also the protests in the summer that continued well into the fall, but they were mainly in the summer, the protests that originated as a result of George Floyd's killing by Derrick Chauvin. Derrick Chauvin was a police officer, and George Floyd was just a citizen. George Floyd was killed because Derrick Chauvin placed his knee on George Floyd's neck for almost 9 minutes. A lot of people were angry about that. That's what caused the nationwide outrage. So this year overall has just been a very tumultuous year. It's been very chaotic. It's been very bad for a lot of people. And I'm kind of glad this year is ending because it's been a very intense year and intense for all the wrong reasons. So that is why I think that this presidential election was possibly the most important election of my life because the winner of that election would have had to oversee a lot because we're still deep into this pandemic. We have the vaccine out, but only like a million or 2 million people in the country have gotten the vaccine. That's like less than 1% of the people living in the United States. So that's why this election was very important, mainly because of everything that has happened in this past year. The thing about presidential elections is that generally voters think about a lot more the events that have taken place in the last year of a president's term than the first 3 years. So whatever Trump did in 2017 through 2019, I would imagine the voters did not think about that nearly as much as what Trump did throughout 2020. And because a lot of people think that Donald Trump didn't handle the pandemic that well, polls show that Joe Biden was favored over Donald Trump on the issue of COVID 19 in terms of the handling of the pandemic. So that is the number one reason why I think Joe Biden won this presidential election because of COVID 19. I honestly think that if COVID 19 just didn't happen, if the virus just didn't exist, Donald Trump would have likely won this election. He would have likely gotten the second term, but Joe Biden ended up winning this presidential election mainly because of COVID 19 and people not liking Trump's handling of it. So that is why I think Joe Biden won. But here's the thing, Joe Biden's victory took several days to be announced. It didn't happen on the night of November 3rd because so many people were using mail in ballots for this election, and it's easy to see why. We have a pandemic, a lot of people might not feel comfortable voting in person at the ballot box, so it would be safer for them to just vote by mail, send in a ballot. And a lot of people did that, but what that caused was that made it so that a lot of states counted their mail in ballots either before the regular votes came in or afterwards. And what that meant for the results coming in, for the reporting of the results, was that for a while, early on election day, November 3rd, a lot of states either had only the in person votes reported or only the mail in ballot votes reported. So in states where only the mail in ballot votes were reported, those results leaned heavily towards Joe Biden. But the states that only reported the in person votes early on election day, November 3rd, those states leaned heavily towards Donald Trump at the time. Now, I'm not sure the exact reason for that, there could be multiple reasons, but in general, mail in ballots leaned heavily towards Biden, but in person votes leaned heavily towards Trump. And that is why you saw some states lean heavily towards Trump on election night, but other states leaned heavily towards Biden because they reported their mail in ballots first before reporting their in person votes. And I don't know the exact reason for this, there's multiple reasons for this, but for some reason, for whatever reasons, in person votes leaned heavily towards Donald Trump, but mail in ballots leaned heavily towards Joe Biden for this presidential election. Now, one of the reasons for this, I think, is because Donald Trump told his supporters to not vote by mail, but to instead vote in person, and that is why most of the in person votes were for Donald Trump, but Joe Biden never told his supporters anything like that, so a lot more of Joe Biden's supporters voted by mail than Donald Trump's supporters. So, what this meant was states such as Ohio, Iowa, and Florida at first leaned heavily towards Biden because these states reported their mail in ballots first and then reported in person ballots later on. So, at first they leaned heavily towards Biden, but over time on election night, Donald Trump slowly caught up towards Biden in these states. And in the end, Joe Biden lost Florida and Iowa and Ohio. All three of these states Trump won back in 2016. Joe Biden lost them just like Hillary Clinton did 4 years earlier. These are all states that went to Obama twice, by the way, both in 2008 and 2012. They're also states that went to Donald Trump twice. And that could be just because the states leaned more towards the right now than they did a decade ago. It could also be because Obama was a better candidate than Biden. Whatever reason that happened, Trump won those states, but there were other states such as Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, the Rust Belt states. They reported their in-person votes first and then later on reported mail-in ballots. So on election night, those states leaned heavily towards Trump. Trump was winning by large margins in all of these states on election night, but over time, more and more mail-in ballot votes were reported. So by the end of things, Joe Biden was able to win those states. So by November 7th, Joe Biden had won all four of those states. November 7th is the actual date in which Joe Biden was declared the winner of this election by most mainstream news sources. Wisconsin and Michigan were both called for Biden on November 4th, the day after the election, but Pennsylvania took a few extra days to be called. That wasn't called until November 7th, and when it was called for Joe Biden that morning, that is when Joe Biden had enough electoral votes to win this election, and that is why it was projected on November 7th that Joe Biden was the president-elect of the United States. And because of mail-in ballots this year, a lot of people allege that there was more voter fraud this year than usual, and because of that, the election, which should have gone for Trump, according to them, instead went for Biden. And a lot of lawsuits have been filed in the past 2 months for that because of these claims that there was voter fraud flipping the election in favor of Biden. But nearly all the allegations in these lawsuits turn out to not be true, so the lawsuits didn't work out well for Trump's team. They didn't help him gain any more electoral votes in the Electoral College, and Joe Biden was still able to win this election even with all of Trump's lawsuits. So in the end, Joe Biden got 306 electoral votes, and Donald Trump got 232 electoral votes. The most surprising state for Joe Biden that he won was Georgia. I expected that state to go for Trump pretty easily, but for somehow that was able to go for Biden. I think the main reason for that was because Stacey Abrams, who almost became governor of Georgia in 2018, she was able to get a lot of new voters to turn out for Joe Biden that previously had not voted or weren't planning to vote in this presidential election. So she was able to really increase the turnout for Joe Biden, and that's why I think Joe Biden ultimately won Georgia. So Joe Biden was able to win the presidential election, and the House of Representatives, Democrats were able to keep control of, but the Senate, that's still up in the air as I speak, because two of the Senate races, both in Georgia, they both had to go to runoff elections, the two Senate races in Georgia, because no candidate received 50% of the votes or more in either of these Senate elections. So both of these runoff elections are taking place on January 5th, and on that day, we'll find out whether or not Republicans keep control of the Senate. But besides this election was by far the most important event that took place in this portion of the year, but I think the second most important event was the vaccines for COVID 19. So, in this period of the year, the vaccines were finally able to be released. Obviously, they aren't released for most people, they're released for people who are old, or people with special pre existing health conditions, or people who are frontline workers, workers in the healthcare industry. These people are the ones who need it the most, and that's why they get it first. But also, like Joe Biden himself has gotten the vaccine, Mike Pence has gotten the vaccine, Kamala Harris recently got the vaccine. So, in total, around 2 million people in the United States have gotten the vaccine as I speak. But the vaccine was first approved early December by the FDA. The Pfizer vaccine was the first vaccine to be approved. But we also have the Moderna vaccine and AstraZeneca vaccine, which is going to start being given to patients. So, the first shot of the Pfizer vaccine to a non trial patient was given on December 8th in the United Kingdom and December 14th in the United States. And just a couple days ago, the first patient who got the Pfizer vaccine on December 8th recently received their second shot 3 weeks later on December 29th. So, more and more people will start getting the vaccine in the 2021. And one more important event that took place in 2020, in this portion of 2020, was the massive growth of COVID 19 spread. COVID 19 spread so much in this portion of the year, more than any other part of the year. It got bad in November, it got even worse in December. We were reaching levels higher than anything we've seen throughout this entire year in terms of the spread of COVID 19. At its peak in the summer, we had around 80,000 cases per day of COVID 19, but we've seen levels three times higher in this period of the year. At one point, we've gotten almost 300,000 cases per day. I think at our peak, we had 260,000 cases in a single day. And a lot of people don't know this, but there's been around as many COVID-19 cases in the last 2 months of 2020 as the rest of 2020. So November and December had as many COVID-19 cases as January to October approximately. I'm ending the video off here, but I have one last video for 2020 planned for tomorrow, so I hope you enjoyed that.